All right, thank you for staying with Daybreak. Like I mentioned, we're talking about women in leadership, and even this morning I have a panel of 6 ladies. Let's start with the first 2. Will be speaking to us about how they view the women empowerment initiatives in Kenya. Have we at least leveled the playing field? We'd like to hear from you as well. What more should be done to empower the women in the country, in the continent as well? Trevor Mbija is the Twitter handle, at Citizen TV Kenya, #Daybreak. We'd like to hear from you. Let me introduce my guest really quick. Rose Washuka is joining me. She's the Chief of Staff, Office of the Honorable Chief Justice of the Republic of Kenya. Thank you so much for making time. Aya Shebi is also here. She's the Chair, Nala Feminist Collective, and also former AU Youth Ambassador. Thank you so much for making time. And Rose, I'll start with you. What is your assessment of women empowerment in Kenya? Have we been deliberate enough to at least level the playing field for our sisters?
Thank you very much, Trevor. Allow me, first of all, to recognize that there has been deliberate efforts put in place by government to level the playing field. And by leveling the playing field means actually leveling up the gender equality space. I think you saw the president a few weeks ago in Paris attending the Generation Equality Forum. And there he committed to do several things, including ramping up the support for gender-based violence, including financing, and setting up a gender working group on the same. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done. What more support, though, needs to be introduced to make sure that we are doing better with each coming day? I think if you look at the commitments that have been made globally and the coalitions that have been called to by international organizations led by Generation Equality, there is need to support partnerships. There is need to support financing mechanisms to just make sure that it's not all talk, that we are putting money where it matters, and that policies and legal reform follows that to make sure that actually those solid commitments are backed up by policy and legal reform and financing. Trevor?
Yeah. Aya, what do you think? Because you see, we're talking about women leadership in Kenya, but how is the Kenya leadership felt on the national stage, if we're now talking about continental and even national stage?
I think Kenya has a great responsibility on the international stage because it's not only has been in Paris, and actually the president was one of the few heads of states who moved physically to Paris and made financial and policy commitments. He promised to end FGM by next year. He promised to end gender-based violence by 2030. He has a great commitment to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think also Kenya leading on the Action Coalition of Gender-Based Violence as the only African country also puts a lot of responsibility on Kenya to really be accountable to all these commitments. So I think it's wonderful to hear leaders and to see President Kenyatta really committed and to see Kenya leading on the global stage. But when we go back to the national level now, we really need accountability. We need to see these words and promises translated into projects, translated into progressive policies. We need to see the engagement of young people and young women in this process. We need to see a stakeholder engagement. So it's great words and great promises, but now it's time for action. I think that's what civil society is trying to say.
Yeah, but Rose, you know that action also translates to a bit of information for the people on the ground. Are the people sensitized enough to realize that even if you're a lady or a woman at this particular point, these are your rights, these are the limits someone can go? Are they aware of the empowerment initiatives that are ongoing right now?
I think a decade of constitutional implementation, transformative constitutional implementation, has done great for Kenya. Since 2010, I think the progressive conversations that have been had, trying to unravel, the inequalities of the past, has left Kenyans quite informed about their rights and obligations, despite or in spite of gender. So I do think that the Kenyan public is one that is quite informed. It's very, very informed. And you've seen time and again, Kenyans themselves calling for equality in the workplace, equality in the equality of the law, equality in inheritance, and other things that disparities in terms of implementation before. So I think that it's not enough to continue sensitizing the public, but I do think that the Constitution has done a very good job at ensuring that Kenyans do understand that indeed we needed to move from where we were in 2010 to a place of progressive reform as far as gender equality is concerned.
Yeah. Aya, you mentioned these international declarations, but how then do we ensure that the ordinary citizen knows or even feels the impact of these international declarations that are being made? Aya? We seem to be having a bit of challenges with Aya there, but let me bring back Rose on this. Rose, so you're the Chief of Staff in the Office of the Chief Justice and championing a lot of gender equality there as we speak. What then is the role of justice in women's rights?
Justice and human dignity go hand in hand, and justice and the rule of law are anchoring, prerequisites for gender equality. So the field of justice actually is really an anchor piece to ensuring that the gender equality is upheld. And you've seen the courts give very progressive decisions, very progressive rulings, at the High Court, at the Court of Appeal, at the Supreme Court, as far as gender equality is concerned. So, but justice it goes beyond the actor of the judiciary. It goes beyond to all the other players in the justice sector, including the Law Society, the Office of the DPP, the DCI, the Kenya Police, Office of the Attorney General, the entire framework of justice actors and players in this country have a role to play as far as reinforcing gender equality is concerned. I know that as far as the judiciary is concerned, there's a very progressive gender mainstreaming policy. And if I can tell you, Trevor, the judiciary is at par. They has attained parity in terms of men to women ratios in the workforce. And that's a great example. That's a great example to be emulated. And I know there's a very redundant debate that we actually do not need affirmative action. But we are not at a place where affirmative action has ceased to be relevant, because we still have disparities in the higher echelons of leadership as far as women and women representation is concerned. So, Trevor, justice is a fabric that weaves together all the aspects that come together for gender equality. Remember, gender equality is actually a human right. It is a cause in justice. And so justice is really a reinforcing bit. And gender equality itself is an act of justice.
Yeah. Aya, before I lost you there, you are the former AU Youth Ambassador. What are some of the challenges you see when it comes to women empowerment that you think still need to be addressed up until today?
Yeah, I mean, I think gender-based violence is a global issue. It's not only an issue in Kenya. And I think the challenge there is for heads of state and government, when they meet and they assemble, whether in the African Union or the United Nations, for them to consider gender-based violence as violence. We are not, until today, making sure that it's a peace and security issue, because unfortunately, peace and security issue is always the priority of member states, and it's always put on the top of the agenda. So if we manage to get gender-based violence on that agenda, I think that's when heads of state and government can take gender-based violence more seriously and can take the gender agenda more seriously, because FGM, female genital mutilation, is violence. Rape is violence. Child marriage is violence. All of these issues affect the whole ecosystem of society. And there is a research that says if we don't act now, we will wait 108 years to reach gender equality. I don't think our generation wants to wait 108 years. And so that's why we are pushing as civil society in the intergovernmental space for action and for, as Rose said, putting the money on the table. And I think our call when we were in Generation Equality was stop talking about gender equality and start funding gender equality. And it's not only the promise, because in Generation Equality, global leaders came together and actually committed $44 billion to the gender agenda. That's amazing and that's great, but how it's going to be spent, what is the accountability mechanism for it, Is it going directly to the most vulnerable, to the communities, or it's going to be stuck in bureaucracy as usual? So I think it's also the institutional transformation that is needed at the national level. And it's not only let's fund gender equality or let's do programs for gender equality. I think we have to change the whole approach to how we actually empower women, how we empower communities. And I think Kenya has been a voice for that. And we now want to see how that will actually translate concretely on the ground.
Yeah, Aya, stay with me for a bit because you mentioned the 44 billion shillings that was committed at the Generational Equality Forum. Which model have you seen work before when it comes to empowering people from the grassroots? What would you prefer? Because there's the rigors of bureaucracy, like you mentioned, but what model works before? Should we go the CBO ways? How best can this money trickle down and reach the people who are actually vulnerable?
I think, first of all, it has to start with a dialogue with different stakeholders. And civil society has to be a key stakeholder in the implementation. Young people, especially young women, have to be key implementer of the agenda. I think the whole concept of don't talk to us or about us, talk with us. This is what young people have been, crying for. If we are at the table, it doesn't mean you're just ticking a box and saying, oh, okay, we brought young people, now we are on the agenda, but actually co-create the implementation plan and don't invite civil society or the people most affected just to receive, to be on the end or to be in the closing ceremony. So really the approach that should be taken for community engagement is to start with a dialogue. And I think that's why we're here in Kenya as NALA, is to really bring all different stakeholders, start a dialogue and co-create the implementation plan from the start. In the design, in the co-creation, in the implementation, civil society, the most vulnerable, the most affected, the communities, the young women, the girls have to have a voice at the table.
Yeah. Rose, anytime anybody hears feminist movements or feminist voices, it's always an us versus them conversation. How do we bring in the men and the male gender to also realize that if you stay on the fence on an issue of oppression, then you're with the oppressor?
Trevor, thank you very much. That's a misconception. In that, it actually is a negating, dialogue, because I think feminist, when you talk about feminist movements, it doesn't have to be exclusively women movements. I think if you look at the evolution of the women's movements, which essentially started as the feminist movement, the agenda at the time when this movement started was very different. Remember, we started at a time when women were not even allowed to vote with the suffragist movement. It started at a time when women were really a chattel to be owned by their partners. I think we have progressed from that period to a period where, when you talk about feminist movements, these are movements that actually have the goal of gender equality at heart, regardless of gender. And I think that has been, that needs to be understood very, very clearly. You have the he for she movement that has done extremely well. And I think you cannot succeed if you make it a sectional agenda. It is not a sectional agenda. It is actually an agenda that touches the core of human dignity, the core of human, our common race, because you cannot exclude half of the population and expect, to progress and proceed in any venture that you actually undertake. So I think the evolution needs to be understood. And the need for the feminist movement in the 1800s, in the early 1900s, is largely has the same spirit, but different players because of the changing tides and the changing landscape we are in today. And so you're seeing leaders, global leaders, male presidents, civil society actors that are mixed, championing feminist movements. So it is not a sectional agenda, Trevor.
Yeah.
It is an agenda that is collective and collectivized. And that is the way it's going to succeed. And that is the way that we are championing it.
Yeah. And I'd like to hear from both of you on this. And I'll start with Aya. The role of culture. There's still certain places where culture still plays a very big role in how women are treated and how the categories come in for the boy child and the girl child. How do we deal with that to ensure that it is almost a level playing field despite the different cultural beliefs?
Let me first really comment, because I think the question on men engagement is so critical. And I think for men, it's not enough to just say, I'm a feminist on a platform. Even heads of state and government now in Africa say they are feminists, but you need to be a feminist man every day. The way you treat your colleague, the way you treat your wife, the way you treat your daughter, the way you treat women everywhere. The same way women resist everywhere. I mean, gender equality is not something we talk about on global stage or on the media. It's our daily life. Since the moment we wake up, we take the transport, we go to work, to the workplace, or we go to school. Every single step during our day reminds us of our gender, whether being harassed, whether being abused, whether being segregated because of your gender, because you're pregnant, because of all sorts of things. So really, we need to change the approach of supporting women movement by just standing on a global stage and changing policies, which is great, but you need to start being feminist in your own daily life and stand up for women's rights every single day. Now, on the cultural aspect, I think it's extremely important to be part of the implementation plan, because it's not enough to ban, for example, female genital mutilation, which happened in many African countries, but we still see the practice of female genital mutilation happen because the community was not involved and because the community was not part of the process. So if there is no ownership on the ground of these policies, they will not be implemented. And I think culture is not static. Culture must change. So when we say we need to end female genital mutilation, we need to end child marriage, the response we see is that, oh, we're not preserving our culture. We love our African culture in our different countries, but there is a culture that we need to preserve, and there is a culture that we need to get rid of.
All right. Rose, what do you think?
I mean, I do agree with Aya's sentiments and adopting totality has her views on the issue. Safe to add that, I think sometimes culture suffers our own inadequacies as human beings. And then we blame culture for the things that we do not want to change and the things that, that work for a section of the human population. And so I think that, as Aya said, culture is not static. And it doesn't mean that when you change a culture, that you negate the spirit of that culture. I think there are different ways of evolving cultures without putting anybody's life in danger. And a great example is actually the approach to end, female genital mutilation using the Ushanga initiatives as a platform. So you bring in reinforcing aspects, economic empowerment in the 7 frontier pastoralist counties in the country by ensuring that women have alternative livelihoods and that they actually have that economic empowerment to be able to push back against negative cultural practices. And so I think that, we should stop, castigating culture for our own human inadequacies and actually push forward in ways that reinforce human dignity while maintaining the spirit of our cultural practices. Yeah. But culture should not be used as an excuse to negate the fullness and the wholeness of the lives of women or anybody in the society. They are not static aspects, and they can be molded and they can move. Who sets culture? Isn't it the human? Isn't it a community that settles on culture? So if a community then defines culture, then why do we take history as a burden unto our lives? What we do is mold it to today's progressive values. And therein, we continue to progress culture and to maintain it and to work it in a way that it doesn't endanger any of us in our society. So human beings and our communities should stop blaming culture for our own inadequacies in our own resistance to change and protect human dignity in all its forms.
Yeah. And Aya, do you think sometimes even the terms that are used then is what demeans the attempt to empower women in one way or another? Because we've seen when it comes to political appointments, some people calling it tokenism. They say that if we are going to push that idea that we are on a level playing field, then let everybody go to the field and let people be elected the way the electorate wants it, without specifically leaving some slots for women, because they're now calling that tokenism.
I am absolutely for quotas and for reserving the space for women, because historically women have been excluded from leadership. So if we don't reserve the space for women, they will not be able even to run for office. there is this idea that if you open up election to both gender, women will be able to run for office. But financially, structurally, with patriarchy, women are not able even to climb the ladder in politics or even in their own workspace. So we also sometimes ignore the daily challenges women face to even navigate these spaces. And we just assume that when we open election, women and men are on the same playing field and they equally can participate. No, they cannot. The same way, especially young women are completely segregated. They cannot afford to have a campaign. They are not trusted because they're double crimed being young and being female. There is a picture in society that women cannot lead, that we're not ready in Africa to have, women heads of states. So how can you just open politics and say women and men have equal opportunities? No, they do not. And if we do not reserve their place on the table, there will be no women at the table. Because unfortunately, patriarchy and the way our society is structured wants to keep men in leadership. And so I think it's really important for us right now to have champions in the government, especially, and have progressive policy that look at leadership for merits, by merits. Not leadership because you're men or women, or leadership because wherever you come from, your background or your ethnicity, just leadership by merits. And I think we maybe need to see more women in leadership because so far, I don't think our male counterpart have done a good job in actually leading us to peace and development. It's been 60 years since independence, and we're still talking about very basic issues. So let's have women in leadership, and let's see what women can do.
Rose, what do you think?
Absolutely, Trevor. We need affirmative action to actually ensure that women are represented in the decision-making spaces. If you look at a country like Rwanda and what affirmative action has done in that country and how progressive those policies have played out, then you start to appreciate that, as Aya has said, the landscape is actually woven to exclude and not include women. And so until we get to a time where it's organic to involve the other gender in policies, in decision-making, then we absolutely must continue reserving spaces for women to ensure that they have a place in decision-making. And our own country is a great example. We are going back to the debate of tokenism as a reductive debate. Because we know we know the truth, and we know that actually, if you do not have these affirmative action provisions in place, that women will not be, properly represented in leadership. Go back to the pre-2010 period and tell me, Trevor, how many women were represented in the National Assembly or in Parliament at the time, and how many were actually in actual roles as cabinet, as ministers, or in the executive, or even in the judiciary. And then contrast that with what affirmative action policies, and particularly Article 27 of the Constitution, has done. But it is not enough. It is not enough until gender equality becomes a part of our lives, and until our psyche is so tuned on that we do not debate about, looking at men and women as equals in terms of leadership, in terms of community engagement, in terms of legitimate occupation of, spaces of policy making and absolute decision making, but also economic empowerment. Money doesn't belong to one section of the community, and economic policies must be empowering across board and across, to everybody in our society. And so if decision-making strategies have to, be protected using affirmative action policies, then also we must ask whether our financial systems are also geared towards empowering women. And we are seeing progressive policies because of this affirmative action policies that we have in our country. So, Trevor, we are not done. And we are going to continue to say that, yes, we need to reserve spaces for women until a time when it is second nature, that it is a non-negotiable issue, that actually women are as capable as men.
Yeah, let me just throw the span in the works here, and I know you're going to kill me for this, Aya. There's this conversation that some men in the quarters always have and say that if women are the majority, they could easily empower themselves. For example, if we went to the ballot and they decided that they're voting for one of their own, one of their own would actually win?
I mean, Rose mentioned the Rwandan example. Rwanda has the first parliament in the world that has majority women. So yes, but women can go out, and vote. But again, women being in leadership is a structural issue. It's not as easy as put in the ballot box and have women in leadership. It's really about empowerment from the ground and about, as Rose said, also being economically empowered. I think bottom line, what we need to realize, whether women voting for women or men voting for women, is to understand and appreciate female leadership, because female leadership is emotionally intelligent and is collaborative. And I think even men in leadership should have female traits to their leadership. So the issue now, besides talking about policies, besides talking about parity, besides talking about quotas and affirmative action, is actually how do we look at female leadership? How do we perceive it? There is an assumption that, women in leadership are emotional, women are sensitive, but women actually, this is scientifically, the way women lead, they want everybody's voice to be heard. And I think that's what we need. When we talked about at the beginning, what does accountability now looks like? It looks like co-creation. It looks like the voice of the community, the voice of different stakeholders on the table. And I think that's what women can bring to leadership. Women have the capacity to actually work in a collaborative manner and have everyone's voice heard on the table. And I mean, just on your show today, you have one of the most and youngest women in leadership in the country. She's been the chief of staff of, I think, 3 or 4 ministries, and she has, made impacts along the way of her journey of leadership, not only on Kenya, but globally in the Green Movement. So I think we need to amplify these stories of women who hold leadership and what kind of impact they make. If we're able to document that, I don't think any man would actually need convincing then to have women in leadership or to vote for a woman, because they can see women can make results. And what do we need today? We need governance. We need the delivery of services. We need results. So whoever gender can bring that, we need to vote.
Rose, what do you think?
Trevor, I'll give you a story. In 2008, I decided to run for office, university politics. So I decided to run for president of the law association at Moy University. And I remember my tagline was agenda, not gender. Because I do think that when we are told that because women are majority voters in the country, and so if we wanted women in leadership, we would easily get that, it is actually reducing the conversation to a very basic issue, such as gender. And I do think, as Aya has said, it is not different. In fact, if not better, when women present their agenda. And that is what ought to be considered in the political scheme. However, Trevor, you know that structurally, that space is actually quite hostile to women. You have seen, public assault of female leaders in this country. And what picture does it send to young women needing to run for office? Trevor, I used to have this dream that I wanted to become the president of this country. But I can tell you that thought process keeps shifting because of the environment that I see on the ground. And sometimes I actually question my capacity to navigate that system because of it's actually a violent space, which is quite unfortunate, because we need to ensure that it is not a violent space, that it is an enforcing space, that it is an empowering space, and then we can say that it is an equal space to compete. So that's why we need affirmative action policies still, until that space stops being a violent space as it is today.
All right. Aya, let me bring you back into this conversation, and this one now is on these empowerment initiatives. Should women be categorized differently then? Because even when it comes to, when we're talking about economic empowerment right now, there's the AGPO, which is access to government procurement opportunity. It is a certificate for women, youth, persons living with disability. Should we have specifically women-targeted initiatives without lumping it all up with all the other categories?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the same way we advocate for youth to be empowered and to have their own programs, the same way we, advocate for women to be empowered and have their own program, indigenous people, and the list goes on, people with disability, people of diverse gender identities. So I think it's also about bringing all these stakeholders together, because we believe, for example, in intergenerational dialogues. We believe that we shouldn't also create women-only spaces or youth-only spaces without integrating them in the whole picture. But I think it's important to have their own programs to be empowered, because obviously women have their own challenges in society. Okay, obviously we live in in a society today when women drop out of school because of their periods. Obviously, we have, women who cannot run for office because all sorts of exclusion and economic barriers and political barriers. So, of course, we have to have programs directed to women, and specifically young women. And I want to emphasize on that, because young women really face double challenges in societies. Young women and girls who are really seen as, voiceless, and they don't have the power to decide for themselves and their bodies, who are seen, as there is always the man who provides, there is always, head of the family who decides their future, what they study, what they wear. So we need to really provide empowerment for women, because the way we grow up in society as girls, we're seen as girls. It's always seen as, the girl is the one who, the boy goes to school, the boy goes to work, and the girl stays at home. So we have different challenges, and obviously we need to be empowered in a specific way. But I also want to emphasize that we shouldn't then isolate women issues, because society sometimes sees women issues as like only for women. But women issues intersect with other issues, with climate issues, with political issues, with corruption, with governance, with all sorts of issues. So we can't see in a linear way. We can't see women empowerment is, let's bring a group of women, and give them loans, and we fix the problem. No, the financial system is not working. So even if we give them loans, it's not going to work. And then we cannot say that they failed because they're women. No, because the whole system now needs to change and needs to transform. We can't put women in leadership. She's the only woman in leadership in an institution that is completely failing and cannot be restructured, and then say women failed because we put them in leadership and look what they delivered. So I think we need to also make sure that women empowerment issue intersect across society and across the ecosystem.
All right, Rose, what do you think? Rose?
Trevor, I think you have a bit of a lull there.
Yeah, go ahead. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yes, go ahead. I wanted to hear your views on whether we should have specific initiatives for women and not lump it all up with the vulnerables, like the youth versus the disability and all that.
I think it depends on the issue, Trevor. If you're looking at political inclusion, financial inclusion, education, healthcare, different issues affect women differently. But what I can tell you is that, the consideration that, women or the factors that affect the proper enjoyment of all amenities, welfare amenities by women need to be considered on a case-by-case basis. Allow me to give you the example of healthcare policies in this country. Child mortality and maternal mortality ought to be addressed as a child mortality and maternal mortality issue, and need to be given the due consideration that they require. Education, the platform for girls' education in the Commonwealth, led by Ambassador Amina Mohammed, is actually primarily trying to put back 30 million girls in Commonwealth countries who are actually out of school. And that number is highest in girls. So the issue of education, how does continuation and continuity of education, how is it affected by the specific factors that affect women and girls just because of their gender? As Aya said, menstruation and period hygiene is a huge, has a huge effect on continuation of education by girls, as does a child molestation and teenage pregnancies, because actually teen pregnancies in most cases are cases of abuse. If you think about political inclusion, you have violence, you have utter exclusion and propaganda against women. So when you lump up women issues, what is women issues? I don't think that there is a category of welfare aspects that is called women issues, but we have to recognize that women actually interact with the various welfare issues in very different ways, and very specific attention has to be paid to the factors that actually negate full inclusion and full enjoyment of those welfare attributes. And as I said, there's an intersectionality component. Take, for instance, climate change. I'm sure you know, Trevor, that a majority of small-scale farmers in Africa who actually drive the African food agenda are women. And their economic situation is actually grossly affected by a changing climate. And so we must, isolate that issue and look at it as a climate issue, but a climate issue that affects the majority of small-scale farmers feeding the continent who happen to be women. Do you see where I'm going with this? That when we become extremely simplistic, when we merely say that, oh, we're tired of this women empowerment issue. But actually, why don't you isolate the various issues of intersectionality that affect women in the various spheres where they're actually included, and then deal with those issues in a very targeted, in a very empowering, in a very progressive way, without having to think of it as tokenism or as female empowerment and girl-child empowerment as being something that is really prevalent and that something that we have to press the brakes on. Yeah. It's actually a cause of human survival. Okay. It is pegged on human survival, because if we do not take care of the small-scale farmers who are feeding the continent because of the effect of climate change, we are looking at starvation across the continent. If we do not take care of education, we are looking at losing about $40 billion per year from the economy, global economy. So we have to look at it in a very, very targeted way and not be lazy about it.
Okay. Aya, let's take closing remarks from you, and I'll start with you. Where do we go from here? What would you like to see?
What I would like to see accountability. I don't think we lack progressive policy on the continent. I served in the African Union. We have one of the most progressive policies and resolutions and treaties in the continent and in the world. So I think it's time now for implementation. It's time for accountability. It's time for partnership and everyone to come on board and to see again the gender agenda as the agenda and not something that should be treated on the side or should not be prioritized. And I want to invite everyone to also join our dialogue at 9 a.m., which we are bringing and partnering with 3 pillars of the government, the Ministry of Gender, the Ministry of Youth, and the Judiciary. And Rose Bashuka is one of the council members of Nala Feminist Collective. And we actually created this collective to also put on the map in Africa, the gender agenda as the agenda, because we are 17 women who are the youngest parliamentarians, the youngest ministers, the youngest entrepreneurs who have really proven leadership and want to inspire other women that is possible in Africa. And we don't need permission to serve our continent. We have to challenge, the status quo. We have to challenge what doesn't work in our society and together really move forward the agenda. So I really call on everyone to join the dialogue, and wherever you are in your community to be a champion of this agenda, because it affects you primarily, whether you're men or women in society. It affects your daughter, your wife, your colleague, every woman in your society. And I believe every man listening to us would like to see an equal society. If we break it down, it is for all of us, it is to benefit all of us to really have a society where we live as equal, we have equal opportunities, and we progress our society together, and we really provide dignity for our people. So this is a collective agenda, and we invite everyone to join Nala Feminist Dialogue happening right after at 9 a.m.
All right. Rose, and for the record, I think, Rose, you should actually run for president.
Thank you, Trevor. Trevor, if for the state helps in making sure that the space is not violent, then we will have a lot more women, not just myself, running for these monumental positions. And we already have head starts. We have incredible women who've gone for it with nothing but courage and the determination to, show that it actually is possible to occupy some of these spaces. But where do we go from here? I think, Trevor, what I would like to encourage us to do is actually live in courage. And courage is important because it's going to allow us to trend into areas that we would ordinarily be afraid to go into. And then to be very deliberate about upholding justice and human dignity, because these two values encompass and all the aspects that we're talking about. Is it just, Trevor, that we actually have to remind people that women are equal to the rest of the population? Is it just that we need to actually make this an agenda, a global agenda, to remind the rest of the world and the rest of the population that actually, look, we are here. We are every bit as competent and as determined and as, empowered to actually take on this space as anyone else. I don't think so. And so if we take on the causes of justice and human dignity, because actually those are two values that encompass everything, then I think we will have a bright future. It is not all gloom. I always look at the glass as half full. And I think that the suffragist movement and the women's movement did a lot to allow myself and Aya to be on your show today, Trevor, because had it not been for these women and these movements, I don't think we would have gone to school, to be honest. I think I would still be in Nyeri, trying to look after a family and a couple of children, which is not bad. But I think we also need to recognize that the people who have gone before us have done exceptionally well. And it's the same thing that we're doing in the call of courage, to stand in the gap and to say, I may be wounded today, but I'm wounded today so that tomorrow you stand in a safe space and your voice can be heard a little farther than mine was. Okay. So I think personal initiative, individual responsibility to actually make better spaces where we are, and then that collective action to move forward is what we need today, Trevor. All
right, ladies, thank you so much for having that conversation with me this morning. Rose Washuka, Chief of Staff, Office of the Honorable Chief Justice of the Republic of Kenya, and Aya Shebi, Chair Nala Feminist Collective, and also former AU Youth Ambassador. Thank you for having that conversation. Like I mentioned, we're taking a quick break here on Daybreak. When we come back, I told you today it's an all-female panel. I'm vastly outnumbered. Rachel Mikali is here, founder CGHRDs. She'll explain what that is in just a bit. Edita Ochieng, you may remember her from the by-elections in Kibra. She's also here. She's a political aspirant. Marianne Wanjiru is also here, community activist, and Wanjiru Nguhi. She's a lawyer. We're all talking about women empowerment and what more needs to be done. I see a lot of your feedback there. We'll read some of them as when and when we return at Trevor Mbija at Citizen TV Kenya. Use the hashtag Daybreak. See you in a bit.
Thank you.